Let's go to Manny. The phones are working now. Manny Marotta, he is a freelance journalist. He actually flew from Pittsburgh to Ukraine to cover the lead up to the war with Russia, and he got caught up in it. He is now in Poland after a very long walk. Hello, Manny. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on the show.
You bet. Glad that you're out safe. Can you tell us what it was like over there when the alarms first started going off and you knew, oh, man, we're in trouble?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, up until the invasion, nobody knew that anything was wrong. And then suddenly, on the morning of the invasion, we woke up to the sound of air raid sirens. And it turned out that cities all over the country were being bombed, and our city could have been next. I was in Lviv, which was a western Ukrainian city. We went outside and we heard people speaking on loudspeakers saying, find shelter, help the elderly, stockpile water. It was rather scary. I mean, the whole country began at once to panic. And
it was one day, literally one day, nothing's really happening, to, oh my gosh, here it is.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. For the longest time, the Ukrainians denied that anything was happening because they wanted to preserve their sovereignty. They wanted to preserve their country. And so they said Putin won't invade. And we all believed him. And we all believed Ukraine. And it really seemed like Putin would not invade. And then this really came upon us suddenly. Russian army was in Ukraine. Bombings were happening. And, of course, now thousands of people have died in this war with Russia.
So tell us, I mean, because we're seeing social media and we're seeing unbelievable heroism on the part of the Ukrainian people and the president of Ukraine. It seems like they're not willing to go anywhere. Is that the truth of what's happening?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, from what I saw from the Ukrainian people, they will defend their sovereignty until the very end. Ukraine is a relatively newly independent country. In 1992, they freed themselves from the Soviet Union, and now they are trying to defend themselves in the greatest possible sense. It's only been 30 years since they've become newly independent, and now Ukraine is trying to establish its own identity in Europe and trying to keep itself free from, the reins of Russia coming back to retake it. And so the Ukrainian people are going to defend every street, every home, every alley, every inch of Ukrainian soil they can, and they are enthusiastic about it like you've never seen.
Because they remember what life is like under Russia. I mean, I can't believe that Putin thinks that they would remember things, that they would forget things like the Holodomor quickly.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
You tend to have a long memory on stuff like that.
Absolutely, and the Holodomor is part of the national memory of Ukraine, and they mourn it all the time and everywhere. There are monuments to it in nearly every major city, and of course, life under the rest of the Soviet times was terrible for the average Ukrainian. There were repressions. You couldn't practice free speech. You had to stay in line with the party. You couldn't establish a Ukrainian identity. You had to be a part of a Russian identity. And so Ukrainians are worried about that happening again. I spoke to several Ukrainians who had lived under the Soviet Union, older Ukrainians, and they were just terrified that it would be something like that again, that Russia would exert power over Ukraine once again.
So when you're walking out, you had about 50 miles, right? That's 70 kilometers?
Yeah, thereabouts. It was I believe the exact amount was 43 miles and 74 kilometers was the exact number. But yeah, a very long walk, and it wasn't just me. It was thousands of Ukrainians, oftentimes elderly, oftentimes children, and they're the ones who are the true heroes of the story, the vulnerable members of society who are walking out of Ukraine this huge distance.
And what was your conversation like?
My conversation with the Ukrainians?
Yeah, on that walk. What did you learn?
Yeah. Well, I spoke with a wide variety of Ukrainians. I spoke with children. I spoke with young men. I spoke with old women. I spoke with a variety of people, and they all had. They were all unified by their fear of being taken over by Russia, and that's why everyone was walking out. But everybody was, of course, committed to protecting Ukraine as well. and their plan was to reform on the other side of the border and to fight for Ukraine eventually. And so the children, of course, were afraid. The children didn't know why they were leaving. The children didn't know why they were forced out of their beds by this invasion, why they had to march out into the cold, why they had to go without food and water, because these people didn't have food and water for the entire walk. And it was just this long and grueling trek. And so the elderly people, as I mentioned to you before, they remembered Soviet times. They were mentioning that this could happen again, and that's why they were trying to avoid that. And so they were among, of course, the young men who would have to go fight very soon into the walk. They were conscripted into the army, and it was just this wide conglomeration of people united by a fear and a hatred of Russian domination.
When you got to Poland, you're in Poland now, are you not?
I'm in Poland. I'm speaking to you from Krakow, Poland right now.
Wow. When you got to Poland, what did that feel like? What did the refugees go through?
It was just an incredible sense of liberation among the refugees to be in a country that, of course, was not being invaded, but also a country that was still sort of living under the specter of Russian domination. And now we're in Poland, which is a free country, a country that has its own long history of repression by Russia. And there's a sort of solidarity between the Poles and the Ukrainians. And the Poles have been very receptive to the Ukrainian refugees because of this brotherhood that they have, because of their shared past of repression by Russia. And so the Poles are taking the Ukrainians in private homes, in hotels, in guest houses. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are staying, and the Poles are welcoming them well. And it's just this great sense of relief. But the job isn't done until the war is over, of course.
Tell me about two tweets that you made. One, you said, "We made friends with a 24-year-old named Max who was pulled out of the caravan as he talked with us. I had time to get his number before conscription, and he left with a grin of utter disbelief. I'll never forget that face." And the next one was, "A woman screamed for the army to spare her husband from conscription. A soldier slapped her and took her husband. Things seem really desperate." Tell me about this.
Yes. Well, first I'll tell you about Max. So during the long walk, obviously, as I mentioned, I spoke to many Ukrainians, and one of them was this 24-year-old, as I mentioned, 24-year-old named Max. Maxime was his name. And we walked together for quite a long time. We learned about each other. He's pretty much my age, so we had a lot to relate to with each other, even though we grew up on opposite sides of the Atlantic. And so we sort of made friends. And then towards the end of the walk, in the last 10 kilometers, a Ukrainian army officer came along and said, "All men aged 18 to 60, step out of this caravan right now. You're going to be conscripted into the army." And at first, Max didn't believe he'd have to go. And then the man yelled at him specifically, and he just looked at me with this shrug, this grin of, as I mentioned, disbelief. And he stepped out of line. And I didn't see him for the rest of the walk, of course. But by the way, he did get back in touch with me. So I've been in contact with him since then, and he is safe, and he's in Western Ukraine right now, and he is not currently fighting the Russians. So I'm glad to hear from him. The second story, though, is a lot sadder. As you mentioned, it's this brutal account of a man being taken away from his wife. What happened in that occasion is, as I mentioned to you, Zelensky ordered that all men aged 18 to 60 had to be conscripted into the Ukrainian army. And so this caused a lot of fathers to be taken away from their children, husbands to be taken away from their wives, brothers from sisters, and sons from mothers. And one of these couples, I won't forget, and it's the one that's mentioned in the tweet, the husband and the wife, they began arguing with the soldier. "I don't want to go. I can't go. I have to protect my wife," because these men were often caregivers for their families. They had to protect their families as they crossed the border. And so this man was just trying to protect his family. And the wife was pleading with the soldier. She was on her knees at one point, and she was standing up, and she was crying. And he was pretty not empathetic about it, and he hit her, and they took the husband away. And it was just this tragic scene, and it was not isolated either. This happened 100 times in just the time that I was there, and I'm sure it's happened 1,000 more times. It's crazy.
So is your feeling that most are going because they want to defend their country, but there are a few that are like, I got to protect my family, or are most of the Ukrainians serving because they have to?
I mean, they're caught between a rock and a hard place here. They want to protect their families, of course, and their families' safety is their top priority, but then also they love their country deeply and they want to serve their country as well. And so some men have taken the choice where they prioritize the solidarity of their country over the sovereignty of their country, may I say, over the temporary their temporary safety, their temporary being alive. So they prioritize the sovereignty of the country. And then there's this other group who wants to keep their family safe.
Right.
And these are two very different groups, and they both have noble intentions.
Yeah.
And they're just caught in this tragic situation, So
Manny, what
tough for men in Ukraine? Yeah,
I've only got about 30 seconds for an answer here, but with what you've seen, I've always believed if you send in a foreign troop and you have people that are defending their land, their family, their country, you're most likely going to lose unless it's overwhelming force. With what you've seen, who are you betting on, the Russians or the Ukrainians? Manny, is he there? We lost him. Putin.
It'd be pretty surprising if you said the Russians, though.
Yeah,
I feel like.
Yeah, but I mean, to have somebody that was there and could see it, it would be surprising to hear that. But I think you'd be able to hear what was,
right?
Yeah, what was emotionally and what was.
I thought this was a really underplayed and offensive moment from Joe Biden before this was happening. Remember, they kept saying over and over again, they're coming in tomorrow, they're coming in tomorrow. And he was making all those warnings. And at one point he said, look, if the Russians want to come in here and take it, they're going to take it. And I just remember thinking like, yeah, we all know the different size of the military and the capabilities, and there's a lot to that. But you can't just tell a country that they're going to lose. And they're not going to accept that.
Especially one that hates the Russians, have been occupied and refused to go back.